The morning sun painted golden streaks across Marcus Johnson's pristine front lawn as he methodically tended to his prized rose garden. His collection was a symphony of colors, deep crimsons, soft pinks, and creamy whites that had earned him 3 consecutive Best Roses awards at the state gardening competition. After 6 months in this new neighborhood, the garden had become his sanctuary, a place where the pressures of being one of the city's top surgeons melted away. This particular morning had started perfectly. The weather forecast promised ideal conditions, 70s with a gentle breeze, and Marcus had woken up early, eager to prepare his American Beauty roses for the upcoming spring showcase. He wore his favorite gardening outfit, well-worn jeans, a Harvard Medical School t-shirt that had seen better days, and his lucky gardening hat, a gift from his late father who had first taught him the art of rose cultivation. As he carefully pruned a particularly stunning crimson bloom, Marcus noticed movement behind the delicate lace curtains of number 42. Mrs. Patterson, his neighbor of 6 months, was doing her usual morning routine of surveillance, though he pretended not to notice. He'd tried waving to her several times when he first moved in, but she'd always quickly disappeared behind her curtains. Today, she seemed particularly agitated, pacing back and forth, her silhouette sharp against the window. Marcus focused on his roses instead, gently removing dead leaves and checking for any signs of black spot disease. He hummed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony under his breath. Tomorrow's surgery playlist, while applying his homemade organic fertilizer, a secret recipe that had been featured in Garden and Home magazine last spring. Just a little trim here, he murmured to a particularly stubborn stem, reaching for his premium Japanese pruning shears. The tool's steel gleamed in the morning light as he made precise, careful cuts. Years of microsurgery had given him an exceptionally steady hand, useful both in the operating room and his garden. Behind him, the curtains at number 42 rustled more violently. Mrs. Patterson had her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing dramatically as she spoke to someone. Marcus sighed softly, continuing his work. He'd dealt with similar situations before, but it still stung each time. A young jogger passed by, calling out, "Looking amazing, Dr. Johnson. Those roses are going to crush the competition this year." Marcus waved back, recognizing one of his recent patients whose appendectomy had gone smoothly. The roses did look exceptional this year, especially the new hybrid tea variety he'd developed himself, named Mother's Memory, in honor of his mom who had inspired his love of both medicine and gardening. As he stood to stretch his back, he caught sight of Mrs. Patterson, now frantically typing on her phone, her face pressed close to the window. The morning sun reflected off her glasses as she stared intently in his direction. Marcus could guess what was coming next, but he remained calm, focusing on the gentle task of deadheading his prize winners. In the distance, a siren's wail began to grow louder. Marcus carefully placed his shears in their designated spot in his professional gardening toolkit. Organization was key, whether in the operating room or the garden. He brushed off his jeans, straightened his hat, and took a slow, deep breath of the rose-scented morning air. The siren grew closer, its pitch rising as it approached their quiet suburban street. A small smile played across his lips as he recalled something his father used to say. "Son, the best way to handle ignorance is to water it with knowledge and watch understanding grow." Today might just be the day to put that wisdom to the test. As the police cruiser turned onto Maple Avenue, Marcus calmly continued tending to his roses, knowing that sometimes the most beautiful blooms come from the most unexpected situations. The police cruiser rolled to a stop with professional precision, its blue and white paint gleaming in the morning sun. Officer David Chen killed the engine, but sat for a moment, taking in the scene before him. The dispatch call had mentioned a suspicious person, but what he saw was anything but suspicious. Just his old friend Marcus, surrounded by what had to be the most impressive rose garden in the county. A grin spread across David's face as he stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his badge out of habit. The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of roses, mixing with the subtle fragrance of Marcus's famous organic fertilizer. "Marcus, those roses looking championship ready," he called out, his voice carrying the warmth of a decade-long friendship. Marcus looked up, his concerned expression melting into relief as he recognized David. "If it isn't Officer, I'll block your shot, Chen," he called back, setting down his pruning shears, still bitter about losing our last three-pointer contest. David laughed, the sound echoing down the quiet street. "That was pure luck, Doc. Pure luck, and that ridiculous spin move you picked up in med school." He walked up the perfectly maintained garden path, careful to avoid the newly planted seedlings along its edge. Behind them, Mrs. Patterson's curtains twitched more frantically than ever. The two men performed their elaborate handshake, a complicated sequence of moves they'd perfected during their college days. Left hand slap, right hand grip, spin, bump, and their signature finish that always made onlookers laugh. It had started as a joke in their freshman year, when Marcus was tutoring David through organic chemistry, and had evolved into their personal tradition. "Remember when we first came up with this?" David asked, straightening his uniform. "Right after you helped me ace that impossible OChem final. I still say you saved my entire career that semester." Marcus chuckled, reaching down to adjust a support stake for a climbing rose. "And look at you now, keeping our streets safe while I'm just playing with flowers." His humble deflection made David shake his head. They both knew Marcus had just completed a groundbreaking surgery that made headlines in the medical community. "Speaking of playing with flowers," David said, gesturing at the garden, "I heard through the grapevine that you're entering the state championship again this year. After that article in Garden and Home, you're the one to beat." Their easy conversation was interrupted by the sound of a door opening. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house, clutching her phone like a lifeline. She wore a floral dress that ironically matched the color of Marcus's prize-winning American Beauty roses, and her face displayed a complex mix of emotions as she watched the friendly interaction between the officer and her neighbor. David noticed her appearance, and, maintaining his professional composure, gave her a respectful nod. "Good morning, ma'am. Beautiful day for gardening, isn't it?" His tone was friendly but carried the subtle authority of his position. "I see you're lucky enough to live next door to the best gardener in the state. Have you tried his tips for preventing black spot disease? They worked wonders on my mom's roses." Marcus, ever the gentleman, smiled warmly at Mrs. Patterson. "I was just about to start my morning watering routine. Would you like to learn about the new hybrid tea rose I'm developing? It's quite resistant to our local climate challenges." He gestured to a stunning peach-colored bloom that seemed to glow in the morning light. Mrs. Patterson stood frozen on her front steps, her phone still in her hand, as she watched these two accomplished professionals, one in his police uniform, the other in gardening clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of a surgeon, discuss roses and reminisce about their college days. The script she had prepared in her mind was rapidly unraveling, replaced by something entirely unexpected. David winked at Marcus, both of them recognizing this as a potential turning point. Sometimes, he thought, the best police work happened without a single word about law enforcement. Sometimes, it was just about being human together on a beautiful morning surrounded by roses. Mrs. Patterson's carefully rehearsed speech died on her lips as she watched the scene unfold before her. The morning sun caught her pearl necklace as she slowly descended her front steps, her worldview shifting with each step she took. The sight of Officer Chen and Dr. Johnson performing their elaborate handshake had frozen her in place, her phone now hanging limply at her side. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She had expected a very different scenario, one that matched her preconceptions. Instead, she was witnessing what appeared to be a long-standing friendship between the officer and the man she had reported as suspicious. Officer Chen turned to her with a professional smile, though his eyes held a knowing look. "Mrs. Patterson, I believe you haven't been properly introduced to your neighbor. This is Dr. Marcus Johnson, Chief of Surgery at Memorial Hospital, and I might add, the 3-time state champion in rose cultivation." He gestured toward Marcus with evident pride. "We go way back to our college days at Harvard." Marcus, ever gracious, stepped forward and extended his hand. "I've been hoping for a proper introduction, Mrs. Patterson. I must say the climbing roses along your fence line have excellent potential. With a bit of guidance on pruning techniques, they could be show-worthy." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed pink, matching the delicate Queen Elizabeth roses blooming nearby. Her hand trembled slightly as she took Marcus's offered handshake. The same hands, she suddenly realized, that had performed countless life-saving surgeries, were now greeting her with warmth despite her actions. "Dr. Johnson," she managed, her voice steadying. "Did you say Harvard?" Her nephew had recently been accepted there, a fact she had bragged about at the last neighborhood association meeting. The coincidence wasn't lost on either of them. "Class of '05. Marcus nodded, his smile genuine. "Officer Chen and I met during freshman year. He was struggling with organic chemistry, and I needed help staying awake during those early morning basketball practices. We made quite the study team." David laughed, adjusting his badge. "More like he saved my academic career while I tried to teach him how to make a decent jump shot. Though I have to admit, he's surpassed me in both medicine and basketball now." The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of roses around them, and a curious neighbor walking their dog slowed down to observe the unexpected gathering. Mrs. Patterson became acutely aware of how this scene must look, so different from what she had intended when she made the call. I should explain," she began, but Marcus held up a gentle hand. "Why don't we start fresh?" he suggested, gesturing to his garden. "I was about to demonstrate to Officer Chen my new grafting technique for hybrid teas. Would you care to join us? I've found that gardens have a way of bringing people together." David nodded encouragingly, recognizing the olive branch being extended. "You should see what he can do with a struggling plant, Mrs. Patterson. Same precision he uses in the operating room." "Speaking of which, Marcus, didn't you just publish that paper on innovative cardiac procedures?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. "Cardiac procedures," she echoed, her hand unconsciously moving to her chest. "My sister, she had heart surgery last year at Memorial Hospital. The surgeon was a Dr. Johnson, but I never made the connection." Marcus's eyes softened with recognition. "Sarah Patterson, the mitral valve replacement. She showed me pictures of her garden during her recovery. Those blue hydrangeas were spectacular." The morning sun continued its climb in the sky as the three stood in the garden, the initial tension dissolving like morning dew. A butterfly, attracted by the vibrant blooms, danced from flower to flower, seemingly celebrating the unexpected turn of events. Mrs. Patterson looked at her phone, still clutched in her hand, and quietly slipped it into her pocket. Sometimes, she was beginning to realize, the most beautiful gardens grew from moments of discomfort, when old beliefs were gently uprooted to make room for new understanding. The invitation for morning tea had come spontaneously, as the best invitations often do. Marcus's porch, with its white wicker furniture and hanging baskets of trailing petunias, provided the perfect setting for what would become a transformative conversation. Mrs. Patterson found herself perched on a comfortable chair, a delicate china cup of Earl Grey warming her hands, while Officer Chen excused himself to return to his duties with a knowing smile. "My sister Sarah," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice soft with emotion. "She talks about her surgeon constantly. Dr. Johnson, the miracle worker, she calls you. I never made the connection." She watched as Marcus added a touch of honey to his own tea, his movements precise and measured, just as one would expect from a surgeon. The morning sun filtered through the pergola overhead, creating intricate shadow patterns on the porch floor. Marcus's prize roses provided a colorful backdrop to their conversation, their sweet fragrance mingling with the bergamot scent of the tea. "Sarah was a remarkable patient," Marcus replied, setting down his honey spoon with surgical precision. "She brought photos of her garden to every appointment. Those hydrangeas of hers gave her something to fight for, to get back to." Sometimes, the best medicine isn't just in our procedures, but in having something beautiful to look forward to. Mrs. Patterson's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. "She wouldn't be alive without you," she admitted, the weight of her earlier actions pressing heavily on her conscience. "And this morning, Let's talk about your roses instead," Marcus gracefully redirected, noting her discomfort. "I couldn't help but notice the climbing variety along your fence. Queen Marys, aren't they? Beautiful specimens, but they could benefit from some strategic pruning." Relief flooded Mrs. Patterson's face at the change of subject, but there was something she needed to say. "Dr. Johnson, Marcus, before we discuss gardening, I need to acknowledge what happened this morning. My behavior was based on assumptions that we can now replant with understanding," Marcus finished gently. "In my experience, both as a surgeon and a gardener, growth often requires removing what no longer serves us to make room for something new." A comfortable silence settled between them as they sipped their tea. From this vantage point, Mrs. Patterson could see both their gardens, her somewhat untamed roses alongside Marcus's expertly manicured beds. The contrast was striking, yet somehow they complemented each other. "You know," Marcus continued, "when I first moved here, I was worried about my roses adjusting to the new soil conditions, but they've thrived, proving that sometimes the most beautiful blooms come from challenging transitions." His words carried a weight beyond mere gardening advice. Mrs. Patterson nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "My late husband was the gardener," she shared unexpectedly. "After he passed, I couldn't bear to change anything about his garden. Every untamed branch feels like a memory." Marcus's expression softened with empathy. "Perhaps we could honor his memory by helping his garden flourish. Sometimes the best way to preserve a legacy is to help it grow in new ways." The morning light had strengthened, casting long shadows across both their gardens. In the distance, the neighborhood was coming to life. Children's laughter, cars starting, the daily rhythm beginning. "I'd like that," Mrs. Patterson said finally, her voice stronger. "Thomas, my husband, he always said gardens were meant to bring people together. He would have loved your roses." She paused, then added with a small smile, "though he might have been a bit jealous of your American beauties." Marcus chuckled warmly. "Then we'll make sure your garden becomes something he would have been proud of." "Every garden tells a story, Mrs. Patterson. Perhaps it's time to add a new chapter to yours." As they discussed pruning techniques and soil composition, something new was taking root, not in the garden beds below, but in the hearts and minds of two neighbors finding common ground in unexpected places. Sometimes, they both realized, the most important growth happens not in the garden, but in ourselves. Their morning tea conversation was interrupted by the sound of small, running feet and muffled sobs. Sophie, Mrs. Patterson's 7-year-old granddaughter, came bursting onto the porch, tears streaming down her freckled face. In her hands, she clutched a broken mechanical butterfly, a precious birthday gift that had captivated the neighborhood children with its colorful spinning wings. "Grandma," Sophie wailed, her red curls bouncing as she rushed forward. "It won't fly anymore." She stopped short at the sight of Marcus, her eyes widening with curiosity despite her distress. The butterfly's wings hung limply, its delicate mechanism clearly damaged. Mrs. Patterson reached for her granddaughter, but before she could speak, Marcus leaned forward with the same focused interest he showed his most challenging surgical cases. "May I take a look?" he asked Sophie gently, his voice carrying the same calm reassurance he used with young patients. Sophie hesitated, looking to her grandmother for approval. Mrs. Patterson nodded, and a little girl carefully placed the broken toy in Marcus's outstretched hands. His fingers, which had performed countless intricate surgeries, moved with practiced precision as he examined the butterfly. "Ah," he said, eyes twinkling, "I believe we have a displaced gear and a loose connection. Nothing we can't fix." He reached into his gardening apron and pulled out a small precision toolkit, the same one he used for his most delicate rose grafting work. Sophie wiped her tears with the back of her hand, fascination replacing sorrow as she watched Marcus work. "Are you a toy doctor?" she asked, edging closer to observe his careful movements. Marcus smiled, carefully aligning the tiny gears. "I'm actually a heart doctor, but I believe everything deserves a chance to fly again, whether it's a butterfly, a person's heart, or," he glanced at Mrs. Patterson, "a garden that's lost its keeper." Mrs. Patterson felt her own heart warm at the gentle reference to their earlier conversation about her husband's garden. She watched as her granddaughter, usually shy around strangers, became completely absorbed in Marcus's repair work. "Would you like to help?" Marcus asked Sophie, holding out a small screwdriver. "Every good doctor needs an assistant." The little girl nodded eagerly, and for the next few minutes, Marcus guided her hands as they worked together to repair the butterfly's mechanism. "Now," Marcus instructed, "turn this gear very gently, just like we're opening a flower petal." Sophie's tongue stuck out in concentration as she followed his directions. Suddenly, the butterfly's wings sprang to life, spinning and catching the morning light in a rainbow of colors. Sophie's delighted laugh echoed across the porch, drawing smiles from both adults. "It's flying again," she exclaimed, bouncing with joy. "Thank you, Dr. Butterfly. Dr. Johnson is a very special neighbor," Mrs. Patterson explained to her granddaughter, her voice thick with emotion. "He makes all sorts of things better." "Like Grandma's roses?" Sophie asked innocently, causing both adults to share a meaningful look. "Exactly like that," Marcus agreed, standing up and brushing off his gardening clothes. "Speaking of which, Sophie, would you like to learn how to make roses grow better? I could use an assistant in the garden too." Sophie's eyes lit up, but she looked to her grandmother for permission. Mrs. Patterson smiled warmly. "I think we could both learn a lot from Dr. Johnson's gardening expertise." As they watched Sophie skip down the porch steps, her repaired butterfly spinning joyfully in the morning sun, Mrs. Patterson turned to Marcus. "You have a way with children," she observed, "just like you have a way with gardens, and neighbors who needed their own kind of repair." Marcus smiled, gathering his tools. "Sometimes the smallest fixes make the biggest difference," he replied, watching Sophie examine his prize roses with newfound interest. "Whether it's a butterfly's wings, a person's heart, or," he paused thoughtfully, "the bridges we build between gardens." In that moment, as the morning light played through the spinning wings of a mended butterfly, both neighbors understood that some breaks were meant to happen, if only to show us how beautifully things could be fixed. The weekend arrived with perfect gardening weather, mild sunshine, and a gentle breeze that carried the promise of spring. Marcus was tending to his signature roses when he noticed Mrs. Patterson struggling with an overgrown section of her garden. She stood before a massive tangle of climbing roses, pruning shears in hand, determination on her face despite her obvious uncertainty. Without hesitation, Marcus gathered his premium gardening tools and made his way to the low fence that separated their properties. "Those climbers can be tricky," he called out warmly. "Would you like some help preserving Thomas's legacy?" Mrs. Patterson turned, relief washing over her features. "I've been staring at these for 20 minutes, she admitted with a small laugh. "Thomas always made it look so easy." She gestured at the wild growth that had once been her husband's pride and joy. "I'm afraid I've let things get a bit out of hand." Marcus stepped through the garden gate, taking in the scene with an expert's eye. The roses, though overgrown, were healthy, a testament to the strong foundation Thomas had laid. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes the most beautiful gardens come from combining what was with what could be." Together, they began the delicate work of pruning and training the climbing roses. Marcus demonstrated his techniques, showing Mrs. Patterson how to make clean cuts at just the right angles. "It's like surgery in a way," he explained, carefully removing a dead branch. "You have to know exactly where to make the cut to promote healthy growth." As they worked, Mrs. Patterson shared stories about Thomas and his passion for gardening. "He proposed to me in this very garden," she revealed, securing a wayward vine to its trellis. "Said he wanted to grow old with me surrounded by roses." Her eyes misted over, but her smile remained steady. Marcus listened attentively while teaching her about proper pruning techniques and the importance of air circulation between plants. He shared cuttings from his prize-winning roses, showing her how to prepare them for successful propagation. "These are from my mother's memory line," he explained. "I think they'll complement Thomas's varieties beautifully." The morning stretched into afternoon as they worked side by side, transforming the overgrown space into something that honored the past while embracing the future. Other neighbors stopped to watch the unlikely pair, amazed at the transformation taking place, not just in the garden, but in the gardeners themselves. "You have his touch," Marcus observed as Mrs. Patterson successfully deadheaded a particularly challenging bloom. "That natural instinct for knowing what a plant needs. It must run in the family." Sophie shows the same intuition. Mrs. Patterson beamed at the compliment. Speaking of Sophie, she hasn't stopped talking about Dr. Butterfly and his magic garden. She asks every morning if she can come help with the roses. "She's welcome anytime," Marcus replied, demonstrating how to create the perfect mulch layer. Every garden needs a touch of wonder and youth. Besides, she has quite the eye for color combinations. As the sun began its descent, they stood back to admire their work. The garden had been transformed. Thomas's beloved climbing roses now gracefully intertwined with Marcus's new varieties, creating a stunning display that seemed to bridge past and present. "It's not just the garden that needed this," Mrs. Patterson said softly, removing her gardening gloves. "I've been hiding behind these roses since Thomas passed, just like I've been hiding behind those curtains. Sometimes it takes a new perspective to see what's been growing right next door." Marcus nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in her words. "Every garden teaches us something," he replied, gathering his tools. "Today's lesson seems to be that the best growth happens when we're willing to let others in." As they finished cleaning up, Mrs. Patterson suddenly laughed. "You know, Thomas would have loved this. His traditional English roses mixing with your award-winning American varieties. He always said gardens were meant to bring people together." He was right. Marcus smiled, looking at their newly merged garden styles. And sometimes, the most beautiful blooms come from unexpected combinations. In the fading light, the roses seemed to glow, their merged gardens a testament to the power of growth, change, and the bridges built between neighbors who had found common ground in an unexpected place. The morning of Mrs. Patterson's annual garden party dawned bright and clear, the air filled with anticipation and the sweet perfume of blooming roses. This year was different. The invitations had gone out with both her name and Marcus's as co-hosts, a detail that had set the neighborhood buzzing with curiosity. The garden itself was a masterpiece of collaboration. Marcus's award-winning roses now danced harmoniously with Thomas's heritage varieties, creating a tapestry of colors that took visitors' breath away. Small handwritten signs, crafted by Sophie, identified each variety with endearing descriptions: Grandpa Thomas's special red ones, and Dr. Marcus's magic pink flowers. Mrs. Patterson stood at her kitchen window, watching Marcus make final adjustments to the display. He moved with the same precision he used in surgery, ensuring each bloom was perfectly positioned for the afternoon light. She smiled, remembering that morning months ago when she had watched him from this same window with such different emotions. "Grandma, look!" Sophie burst into the kitchen, wearing a dress that matched the mother's memory roses. "I made butterfly name tags for everyone." She proudly displayed her creations, paper butterflies with guests' names written in careful child's handwriting, each one decorated with glitter that was sure to spread everywhere. "They're perfect, sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson said, hugging her granddaughter. "Dr. Johnson will love them." She watched as Sophie rushed outside to show Marcus her handiwork, his face lighting up with genuine delight at the child's creativity. The guests began arriving at 2 o'clock sharp. The usual garden party crowd mixed with Marcus's friends from the hospital, creating an interesting blend of medical professionals and local gardening enthusiasts. Officer Chen arrived in civilian clothes, carrying a homemade blackberry pie and wearing a tie decorated with tiny roses. A gift from Sophie. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Patterson addressed the gathered crowd, her voice clear and strong. Welcome to our annual garden party, though this year is special. She glanced at Marcus, who stood nearby with Sophie perched on his shoulders. This year, we're celebrating more than just flowers. We're celebrating new friendships, second chances, and the power of looking beyond our garden fences. The afternoon unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance. Marcus led tours of the garden, explaining the intricacies of rose cultivation, while Mrs. Patterson shared stories about Thomas's gardening adventures. Sophie fluttered between guests like one of her beloved butterflies, proudly pointing out the flowers she had helped tend. Your grandfather would have loved this, Mrs. Patterson overheard one of her old friends say. He always said gardens were meant to bring people together. Look at how right he was. The highlight of the afternoon came when Marcus unveiled a new rose variety he had developed. I call it Thomas's Legacy, he announced, revealing a stunning bloom that combined the deep red of Thomas's favorite roses with the unique petal structure of Marcus's award winners. A tribute to the man who created this garden, and to the family that continues his legacy. Mrs. Patterson felt tears well up in her eyes as she touched the perfect petals. The rose was everything Thomas would have loved, bold yet elegant, traditional yet innovative. It was, she realized, a perfect symbol of how far they had all come. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the celebrating guests, Mrs. Patterson found herself standing with Marcus near Thomas's favorite bench. I never thought my garden could feel so alive again, she admitted softly. Marcus smiled, watching Sophie demonstrate proper deadheading technique to an amused group of doctors. Gardens are like people, he replied. They can always grow in new directions when given the chance. Around them, laughter and conversation filled the air. Officer Chen was sharing his pie with a group of nurses. Sophie's glitter butterflies had somehow ended up in everyone's hair, and the roses seemed to glow with their own inner light as day faded into evening. It was, Mrs. Patterson realized, exactly what Thomas would have wanted. His garden not just preserved, but growing, changing, bringing people together in ways she never could have imagined that morning months ago when she had stood at her window, making assumptions about the new neighbor tending his roses. 1 year later, the merged gardens of Marcus Johnson and Mrs. Patterson had become something of a local legend. The story spread through the neighborhood, then the city, and finally caught the attention of the National Garden Association. Their unique collaboration, a fusion of traditional English roses and innovative American hybrids, had created something extraordinary. The morning of the city's best garden competition dawned with perfect clarity. Dewdrops sparkled on rose petals like tiny diamonds, and the early sunlight painted the flowers in hues that seemed almost otherworldly. Marcus and Mrs. Patterson stood at the garden gate, surveying their joint creation with quiet pride. Thomas's legacy roses are putting on quite a show this morning, Marcus observed, gently touching a magnificent bloom that combined his horticultural innovation with Thomas's classical style. The variety had become their signature creation, earning recognition in several gardening magazines. He would have loved all of this, Mrs. Patterson replied, adjusting her hat. A new one decorated with small fabric roses, a gift from Sophie. Especially the Sunday gatherings. Their weekly garden parties had become a neighborhood institution. Every Sunday afternoon, the space between their homes filled with an eclectic mix of people. Surgeons discussing rose cultivation with local gardeners, Officer Chen sharing his famous pies, and Sophie leading tours of her garden section, where she was learning to grow her own miniature roses under Marcus's careful guidance. Did you ever imagine? Mrs. Patterson asked, watching the judges approach from down the street. That morning when She trailed off, still finding it difficult to reference that day. Marcus smiled warmly. I imagined a lot of things when I moved here, he replied, but nothing quite as wonderful as this. He gestured to their garden, where Sophie was carefully arranging her handmade butterfly markers next to each rose variety for the judges. The judges were thoroughly impressed by the technical excellence of the garden, but what truly captured their attention was the story behind it. They listened intently as Mrs. Patterson and Marcus explained their journey, how two different gardening philosophies, like two different lives, had intertwined to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The real magic, Marcus explained to the judges, isn't in the roses themselves, but in what they represent. Every bloom here tells a story of growth, not just in the garden, but in ourselves. The announcement of their victory came as no surprise to the neighborhood. That evening, as they celebrated with their now traditional garden party, the Golden Best Garden Trophy sat proudly on a table between their properties, reflecting the sunset like the memory of that first morning. Sophie darted between guests, proudly wearing her custom-made junior gardener apron, explaining to anyone who would listen how Dr. Marcus had taught her to fix butterflies and grow roses. Officer Chen, now a regular fixture at these gatherings, brought 2 pies instead of his usual one, claiming special occasions demanded extra dessert. As twilight settled over the garden, Mrs. Patterson found herself back at her kitchen window. But instead of peering through curtains, she stood in clear view, watching Marcus demonstrate his grafting technique to a group of fascinated onlookers. She thought about that morning a year ago, about assumptions and missed opportunities, about how gardens and people could bloom in unexpected ways when given the chance. "You know," she said later, as they cleaned up after the party, "I keep thinking about what Thomas used to say about gardens bringing people together. I don't think even he could have imagined just how right he would be." Marcus nodded, carefully wrapping the trophy in a soft cloth. "Every garden teaches us something," he replied. "This one taught us that the most beautiful blooms often come from the most unexpected beginnings." As night fell, the garden glowed softly with carefully placed solar lights, another of their collaborative ideas. The roses swayed gently in the evening breeze, their shadows dancing on the lawn that no longer had a fence dividing it. 2 gardens had become one, just as 2 neighbors had become family, proving that sometimes the best endings grow from the most unlikely beginnings. And in the gentle darkness, a mechanical butterfly, long since repaired but still treasured, spun quietly among the roses, its wings catching the moonlight, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could blossom into something extraordinary.